My name is Jonathan Poritz. I've retired from two careers over many years, one as a professor of mathematics and computer science, another in parallel working in various companies and research centers on cryptology, artificial intelligence, and quantum computation. These days I think of myself as a gig worker in the open education movement.
And my name is Kathy Giuffre. I'm a retired professor of sociology. I spent 30 years researching and teaching about communities, networks, social movements, and collective action.
It often seems like today the world is going through a kind of slow apocalypse, with genocidal violence, devastating climate change, global pandemic, and on and on and on, all horribly exacerbated by an awful rightward trend in politics in so many nations. As people who want to do something to make the world a better place, we have found it hard not to despair. But then we remembered that our various careers and lives have given us tools which we find useful and which we hope may be useful to you as we try to resist the slide into dystopia.
So today I want to talk about the media, and I want to talk about the role of the media in mobilizing people for collective action. And once again, I'm going to look at an historical example, which is that between 1929 and 1934, 500,000 workers in southern textile mills went on strike, culminating in the General Textile Workers' Strike of 1934. What was going on that necessitated this? These were people working in southern cotton mills. The conditions there were terrible. I'm going to pull up some pictures to show what was going on there. There was an enormous amount of child labor. Pay was very, very low. So, for example, southern workers, even controlling for the difference in the cost of living, were making on average about a third of what textile workers in the north were making. Of course, black workers were making even less than white workers and were given the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs.
The thing that strikes me looking at these pictures is look how young the children look. With our modern eyes, you look and you think these kids should be in school or should be playing, and instead they're in an industrialized area and they don't even have shoes on, right?
Yeah, so these kids, industrial accidents were commonplace. People losing limbs, people dying, especially children who, because they were so small, they were sent in amongst the machines. They could squeeze into dangerous places. That was what was going on. And let us remember that the Republicans in the United States now want to repeal child labor laws, which were put into place exactly in response to the things that were going on in the southern textile mills at the time. So work conditions were horrific. People lived in mill towns, small towns, very geographically dispersed, that were controlled by the mill owners. The mill owners owned the houses, which meant they could throw you out of your house on a whim whenever they wanted to. You didn't have your own house. Workers were often paid in scrip, which is a kind of money that the company itself would put out so that you didn't get actual money. You only got this company money that was only good in the company store. And in the company store, of course, prices were higher, but you had no choice because you didn't have actual money. And so workers got into what is called debt peonage. They were bound to the company because they were in such debt to the company store that they could never leave. They could never pay off that debt.
I wonder if some of the meme coins that have been created recently by some of the who have risen to power in Washington are intended to be used as more than just clearly they're already a Ponzi scheme, but they're intended to be used more than just that. And more, I always thought of them as some sort of symbol of loyalty. I've invested in the Trump coin or the Doge coin or something like that. But if they could be some sort of coin, only payments would be accepted in this coin for some future service that people will really need.
Yeah, I would never take payment in anything other than the currency of a solvent country, or a euro or something like that. Yeah. What that will be interesting. So this was what was going on here. Local newspapers were also often controlled by big economic interests, and so the local newspapers would side with the mill owners all the time. So we see that there is this complete control of workers' lives and really harsh conditions. So those are the things that led finally to this period of strike activity between 1929 and 1934. And the question is, how is it possible to get 500,000 people on board for strike activity, especially when the response to that was brutal, it was violent, it involved beatings, arrests, intimidation, murder. That was how the mill owners responded to any sort of organizing amongst the workers. How do you get people to do that? So today I'm going to look at an article by Vincent Rossino and William Danaher called Media and Mobilization, the Case of Radio and Southern Textile Worker Insurgency, 1929 to 1934.
I've got to just quickly warn you that wherever you say radio, I'm going to be thinking of the internet, because this is interesting this was the thing that was happening maybe 90 to 100 years ago, but today I hardly know anyone who has a radio, maybe outside of their car, but everyone could be seeing social media, so it'd be interesting to see the analogies for today.
I think the analogies, the reason we're talking about this is I think the analogies are really clear between radio in the 1930s and the internet today.
Okay.
So let's start. The first part of Rossino and Danaher's answer to this question, how do you get people to do this, is by forging a collective identity. And so what do we mean by that? Here's a quote from Rossino and Danaher. Collective identity theorists emphasize ideological, normative, and cultural processes that induce individual participation in collective action and ensure social solidarity, even in the face of harsh counter-mobilization. These researchers also argue that alternative belief structures provide movement participants with a structure of non-material rewards. That is, we believe in this larger collectivity. We believe in collective action. And the rewards for that sometimes are something other than just money. They're things like belonging and being supported by a community. Once we are in this collective identity mode, we're much more likely to engage, to participate in collective action. But how do you do that? How specifically do you get people to participate in this collective identity, to believe in that? And Rossino and Danaher argue that one of the ways is through music. So let's look at what they say. Historically, one of the most obvious means through which group identity has been manifested and shared is through language generally and music specifically. Verbalization through speech or song is always conversational and dynamic, often political, and potentially consciousness altering. So the radio stations in the U.S. at the time were sort of like the Wild West. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, didn't come into being until the mid-1930s. And up until then, the airwaves were local, small, unfettered. It was really do what you want.
This kind of thing that has gone through waves of technology. There were pirate radio stations at some time. It sounded like they were playing this role. Then there was the period of the zines, when people would make physical printouts, which of course always reminded me of Samizdat in the Soviet Union. But right. Now we have kind of individually floated websites that someone spins up a website and starts sharing information and revealing information. There were those websites that had hosted the WikiLeaks data dumps. So I think that role continues to be played by sort of small groups and individuals who are sharing things and organizing their communities sort of on an ad hoc basis in many forms, all the way through today with the appropriate technology of the moment.
Absolutely. And so this reminds me of a lot of the legislative issues around whether the internet will continue to be open and free or whether it will start to be more and more controlled by large corporate interests.
I also hear an echo in what you're saying about kind of the Wild West of the radio stations in this period, and that was so important in getting this movement organized at that time. And one thinks of today and the major platforms that are trying to shut down information access and information spreading. For example, in the last week or so, one of the major corporate controlled platforms has begun censoring all references to Linux, which of course is the free and open source alternative to Mac and Windows operating systems that is used by people who want to control their own machines and not be surveilled constantly. So it's interesting. They're just, for no apparent reason, I think the excuse they use is that it's associated with terrorism, which is kind of a joke.
So that battle is continuing today. Do we have free access to this information or not? And another thing that reminds me of today when I'm talking about this is what we call the digital divide, right? And the question is, do people, sure, the internet exists, but do people have access to it?
The digital divide is an enormous problem, I agree. And I would see it in my students in the small town in Pueblo where I was teaching, that the students would have access to their learning materials. We would be providing them with free learning materials, but if the free learning materials were some huge chunk of data that had to be downloaded repeatedly, the students maybe were sharing a data plan with their entire extended family for their cell phone, and so they could read it on the tiny little screen. They were perfectly happy to do that. But if they had to download it again and again, they would eat up their family's data plan. And so we see these, I think we have to be very conscious in the modern world that people have different physical access, financial access, and so on to these forms of sharing information.
Right. So one of the big questions that comes up is, maybe this information exists, but do people have access to it? So the question for Rossini and Danaher, they're saying that radio played a part in mobilizing workers for these textile strikes, but given the poor conditions that people lived in, can we really think that they had access to what was then the current technology, which was radio? And this is what Rossini and Danaher say. Radio ownership among mill workers was surprisingly high given their low economic status. Hampton's 1935 analysis of leisure time activities among 122 mill workers across 3 mill villages during this period suggests that up to 70% had radios in their homes. Furthermore, when asked to rank 46 leisure time activities, listening to music on the radio ranked highest. So we see that people did at that time manage to get access somehow to this form of information. And I would make an argument that we can see libraries playing a similar role today. So often people can go into libraries, log on to computers, and have access to the internet there, do what they need to do at libraries. And once again, of course, we see the right wing in the United States attacking libraries.
So a friend of mine who's a librarian and was a librarian in a town in Pennsylvania was saying that 90% of her time spent as a librarian was spent dealing with complaints, and of those 90% of those complaints were, as you say, right-wing people bringing in objections to a child's picture book talking about what's that child's picture book that talks about everyone needs to poo, and
Everybody Poops is what it's called.
A classic. And keeping that away from our sensitive young minds is such an important thing that it absorbs all of the energy and time and joie de vivre of all of the librarians, and is an attack on these spaces as a place for other people to get information and build community.
Right. So we see that there was an uncontrolled part of the media landscape in 1934. Let me read this example from Rossini and Danaher. Take, for example, station WBT in Charlotte and station WRBU in Gastonia, North Carolina. Although located near textile mills, mill owners apparently had no involvement or control in either station. Rather, WBT was owned by C.C. Coddington, an entrepreneur and Buick dealer, while WRBU was owned by A.J. Kirby Music Company. Despite considerable discussion, little federal intervention occurred until the mid-1930s. Thus, stations were relatively free to broadcast what they wanted. So the question is, stations were free to do what they wanted. They were owned by things like the local car dealership, or a furniture store often owned them, or some music publishing house would have them. In these small towns, these were local businesses, in these small towns scattered across the textile belt, really tiny towns with really nothing going on other than the mill, a few businesses, a church, and the radio station. So what were they playing? What sort of music did they play? I'm going to give an example here of one of the songs that was popular at the time. It's called The Mill Mother's Lament. And I'm not going to sing it because I don't want us all to die, but I will speak it, I will say it. And when we draw our money, our grocery bills to pay, not a cent to spend for clothing, not a cent to lay away. And on that very evening, our little son will say, I need some shoes, mother, and so does Sister May. How it grieves the heart of a mother, you everyone must know. But we can't buy for our children. Our wages are too low.
It's interesting that survey you cited talked about listening to music as a major form of entertainment. That seems That's a very politically charged form of entertainment. That could have been a good tune as well, but it was certainly not shy about its political message.
Not shy about its political message, and as a matter of fact, I'm pulling up a table here from Rossini and Danaher's article where they look at a number of these songs and the types of themes that were present in them. So we see lots of themes around family well-being, family sustenance, children working, whether their children had to go into the mills or not, their future and the future of their children, of course. We also have worker well-being, lots of songs about the low wages they were paid, about their physical well-being. Remember, these were really dangerous jobs. And even songs about mental well-being, how hard this was on people. But the songs did more than point out problems. They also pointed to specific causes for their problems. So if we look at table 3, I'm pulling that up now, we see that, once again, looking at these songs and seeing what the themes were that were in them, we see there was lots of discussion of the general work conditions, the length of the workday, scientific management, which was the way that workers were put to a time clock and the managers came in to make sure they wrung every last drop of work out of the workers it was possible to do. But we also see, more specifically, exploitation by the owner was a big theme. We see that managerial control and the abuses of that were a big theme, and the presence of scabs. Scabs are people who cross picket lines and took jobs. So that the point of a picket is you close down a factory. Scabs are people who would work and keep the factory going, even when a picket was going on. And of course, these were people who themselves were so pressed for money that they had no other choice. But nevertheless, these songs pointed out that bosses and managers were a huge cause of the problems that workers were facing. So I want to give an example of another song, once again from Rossini and Danaher. This is called The Big Boss and the Worker. The boss man hates the workers hates the boss. The boss man rides in a big fine car and the workers has to walk. The boss man sleeps on a big fine bed and dreams of his silver and gold. The workers sleeps in an old straw bed and shivers from the cold. So we see specific pointing in these songs to the causes of this, to the corporate greed of the owners who are counting their silver and gold while the workers are shivering in the cold.
We also see, once again, how economic inequality is a root cause or an association, certainly has a strong association with these moments of stress and injustice. Similarly, today, we see an incredible economic inequality between the workers and the bosses of companies.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, Rossini and Danaher point out, I'm going to pull up this quote, quoting William Gamson, who's another theorist of social movements. Gamson suggests that an injustice frame, that is looking at this in terms of the injustice, the inequalities here, will be more effective at recruiting and mobilizing if the target is a concrete actor, preferably a person or corporation, presented as malicious, selfish, or greedy.
Boy, do we see that today. The oligarchs just seem so guilty and obsessed with wealth that top 1% of the population of the United States owns 50% of the wealth in the United States. That's just an insane level of inequality.
Right, so it's very easy to present these people as malicious, selfish, and greedy when they are malicious, selfish, and greedy. It makes it very easy. But finally, I want to talk about the one other thing in these songs is that they also suggested solutions and tactics. So here's another table from Rossini and Danaher showing some of the tactics and strategies pointed out by these songs in the songs themselves. So we have songs that talked about the maintenance of solidarity. We have songs that talk about descriptions of strike activity, how to actually do this. We see a few that talked about hostility towards scabs, although that is relatively small. There's only one song that talked about that. And we also see them discussing the counter-mobilization, that is the people who were against them. We see them talking about employee coercion, that is threatening or bribing employees. We see them talking about about incarceration of leaders, that is, putting the leaders of the strike activity into jail. Once again, the hiring of scabs to make the strikes less effective. But the big thing we see is the maintenance of solidarity and people working against this employer coercion.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that our intro and outro music for this podcast, for every episode of this podcast, played by our friend and neighbor Fabio Raggianti, is a bit from Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. And Woody Guthrie, of course, I think was writing and playing around exactly the time we're talking about here. He famously played on a guitar that had written across the face of the guitar, "This machine kills fascists."
Right, and that's great because that's exactly the sort of thing that Rossini and Danaher are talking about. Here's another quote from them. "Symbolism, ritual, and discourse through music are crucial for maintaining solidarity among participants, especially when counter-mobilization is fierce, and for shaping the consciousness of non-participants so that they become sympathetic to or are actually recruited into the movement." So the question is, did this work? Did this, in fact, this music, these radio stations, did it, in fact, mobilize people to participate in these actions? Was it necessary, or just the vile conditions enough by themselves? So I want to pull up a few maps here to look at what Rossini and Danaher found about the dispersal of radio stations and its connection with strike activity. Okay, so the first map I'm going to show is this entire region of the South where a lot of this textile manufacturing happened. And you see the darkened areas. Those are communities, manufacturing communities in counties where there were radio stations, where the radio stations exist. And you can see it sort of in a belt that goes across the middle of the Deep South, where we do see radio stations. Then the next map I'm going to show is the same area, but what we see are places marked with stars where there was strike activity going on. So we see that the strike activity and the radio activity almost exactly match each other. We can see it with our eyes, the way that the two match up. But for those of you who are more mathematically inclined, I'm going to show the chi-square goodness of fit test, which I'm not going to go into the mathematics about, and I'm going to squash Jonathan to keep him from going into the mathematics of it.
But let me just say, what this table is showing us is a very strong statistical evidence that this correlation between the location of the radio stations and the location of the strike activity is not due to randomness. That's the meaning of this chi-squared value. That it's not just luck that these happen to be so close together. The enormously strong statistical significance. There's an association between these two things.
Right, and so that's the key point is, and those of you who are more interested in this can certainly read the Rossini and Danaher article and get all the details about this. But what we see is there's a really strong, incredibly strong correlation between the existence of these radio stations and the strike activity. So one final quote from Rossini and Danaher. They say, "These songs offered a valuable tool with which to recruit and maintain solidarity. Further, they offered the listener, whether protest participant or not, a justification of the mobilization that was unfolding by specifying corporate abuses of economic, legal, and political power. The sharing of these themes, directly and indirectly via radio, for the first time offered Southern mill workers a sense of unity and solidarity that extended beyond the particulars of their specific mill town."
Yeah, Kathy, this reminds me of a book by the sociologist Zeynep Tufekci, a book she wrote fairly recently, a few years ago, called Twitter and Tear Gas, The Power and Fragility of Network Protest, in which she studies the explosion of protests that happened across the Arab world, sometimes called the Arab Spring, and also protests in Turkey. And that it was amazing how quickly the crowds appeared out of nowhere because they were organized on Twitter or Facebook or some other social medium. And she talks about the great power, but then it seemed like there was not a lot of follow through.
So we'll put that resource in the references for this, but I just want to bring up one thing, which is Rossini and Danaher are talking about the collective identity, this formation of an identity, not just a moment.
Exactly. Okay, Kathy, so can you give us some concrete lessons to be learned and for us to act on from this work you presented?
Right, so I think there are 3 points to come out of this work. And the first one is, if you can, make some music, or poetry, or essays, or short stories, or novels, or paintings or memes or stickers are photographs. All of these things matter. We see how those photographs that we showed earlier, some from Lewis Hine, those photographs just documenting what's going on, are incredibly important for this moment and for this movement. So that's the first thing. Make some culture, make some art, make some noise. Thing number 2, even if you feel like you can't do any of that, you can support those who do. Buy art or poetry or music. Listen to it. Show up as a member of the audience. Maybe contribute to the Patreon of people who are trying to make a living doing this. Make it possible for the people who are creating some of this identity-forming work to do that. And number 3 is set up a website of your own. This would be like those wildcat radio stations of the 1930s on the internet. Set up a website, maintain it, and put your own work there, but also boost the work of other people with their permission, of course, but linking to things, putting things out there, making available all of the protest that is happening now. Make that a conduit for that to go out into the world. So, if you want to know more about us or this show, information is available at our website, therevolutionwillnotbetelevised.net.
Thank you.